Welcome to Telegeography Explains the Internet, the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and my guest today is Jeremiah Ginn, software-defined cybersecurity evangelist at AT&T, and author of Diving into SASE, which will be our topic for the day. Jeremiah has been on the end-user side and large carrier MSP side of the WAN table, and brings that kind of dual perspective to his useful new book aimed at providing some clarity to the sometimes confusing SASE market. In our conversation, we talk about how to define SASE, even for different audiences and stakeholders, and how to identify the key elements of what really needs to be included in the SASE framework. We talk about the fast-paced update cycle for security software that's necessary for the modern network and the threat landscape of it, and the implications of this for upskilling and for managed security services. We touch on zero trust and why enterprises really need this security posture to be a part of any SASE framework. And of course, we can't talk about SASE without hitting on SD-WAN and the role of access in the SASE acronym. Finally, I asked Jeremiah about the impact of these security changes on the WAN itself and how corporate networks are going to develop over the next few years. Jeremiah has written what I think is a very clear book with plenty of examples and analogies to cut through some of the confusion that has come about in this emerging SASE market. And I definitely encourage listeners to check the book out. But first, you can listen to him explain many of the topics he gets into on the book here on the show. Welcome to the show, Jeremiah.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, this is an audio podcast, but we do release little clips of us talking in video. And I have to say, you've come to the show the most well-dressed of any guest. I think you're my 50-some-odd guest here. So, kudos to that. And I'll tell you, though, it is still tech, right? So you didn't have to wear a tie, you know.
Well, that's okay. It's a psychological tool to keep me on my game.
That's right. There's the old saying, you can hear the tie, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thanks so much for joining us. We're going to dive into your book called Diving into Secure Access Service Edge, SASE. But first, I wanted to start with just a brief background on you. I met you many years ago while recruiting you to speak at one of our WAN Summit events when you were on the end user side. So I love it when we have guests who have kind of been on both sides of the corporate networks table. But take us briefly through your background, if you don't mind, and what you're up to now at AT&T.
Sure. So, not to go too far back, I served in the military, did special operations as Airborne Ranger and Second Ranger Battalion. That was my second childhood, and that's where I try to live up those standards every single day. Because that's, to me, the greatest thing about that environment was everybody wanted to be at work. Everybody was competing with each other, not to put each other down, but to build the organization up. So I try to re-embody that mentality in everything I do, especially at AT&T, where I come to work to build the organization up.
Right. Absolutely.
A couple other things about me. I have 11 children, through 3 biological and the rest are adopted. Work with multiple foster care organizations. I am been married to my wife for about 28 years, and she saw me in my uniform one time, and she's kept me ever since. So I'm thankful for that.
That's right. Yeah.
Excellent. And then I have 3 grandchildren right now, one on the way. We'd adopted a girl a number of years ago, and she's now 35. So, she was a Marine, married a Marine, and did really good there. Now, my career at this point, I've got about 25 years since the military, and that's primarily been focused on network engineering, but I've worked in a number of roles, building lines of business around networking, building teams, building engineers. And I feel like I get a certain special thing out of engineers because they know exactly, the thing that Zig Ziglar always tried to teach us was nobody knows, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And so I try to put that into my engineers. People have heard me say in conferences and also in books and other notes I put online, is that we've got to love our engineers, and I truly do. I love those engineers, and I try to invest in them every step of the way. Spend a lot of time investing in veterans through different veterans organizations as well. But focusing specifically on the career that we're here to talk about in technology, I got started off at NCR in '97 when I first got out of the Army. And the guys that took interest in me had 42 years of electrical engineering experience, when I started in 1997.
Right.
And those guys really invested in me a whole lot. And all I had to do was, every oddball task there was in the building, clean closets, running a fax machine for 12 hours, building a picnic table. And from that, the guys that were doing the R&D took interest in me and started building me up. So I've tried to repay that throughout my career. And so most recently, the last few years at AT&T, I've been focused on software-defined technologies, virtual network functions, universal customer premise equipment like Flexware or NFV chassis that are focused on published network functions. A lot of cloud architecture. I've touched probably more SD-WAN deals than anybody else in the market. Over 2,300 and counting.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is that. I mean, that's like one a day almost. Right?
Oh well, no. So for a while, they had me in product, and they had me answering questions and dealing with weird problems, which seems to be my specialty. And what was happening was I was doing 18 hours of conference calls a day, 30 minutes per customer. So I was
Right.
rolling
So just
through 30 plus customers in a day, just going through the problems. And what I saw from that was a number of patterns. And so what you'll see in the book is, the benefit of those lessons learned from just going through a lot of pain with my customers.
Excellent. Yeah. All right. I mean, that's really helpful background to understand that process and where you acquired some of this. So you're a busy guy, 11 kids, 3 grandkids, all these sort of organizations. You took the time to write this book on SASE. Why? Why did the market need a SASE book right now?
Sure. So when I started to write the book, or when I started thinking about writing the book, I was contributing to MEF's 117 working group on SASE. And I showed up to the group feeling like I was pretty much the junior guy of the group, and there's a few people in that group that really invested in me and took some time to kind of get me on boarded. So I've spent the last 2 years, and we just released just a couple months ago the SASE and the Zero Trust Framework standards from the Metro Ethernet port, right? And they prefer to go by MEF today. But in the process of that, I was, asked to write a white paper, asked to write articles, and write different things, and it just gave me the courage to articulate, some patterns I was seeing in the market. And actually, I wouldn't have wrote this book if it hadn't been really for the investments that the MEF group has put into me.
Oh, that's great to hear, and certainly I think they have been really helpful in terms of bringing clarity to this market, and reading your book was very helpful for me. One of the things I liked in particular was that it as it was with SD-WAN, I feel if we go back 5 or 6 years now, it is seemingly hard from an analyst perspective to nail down when the word SASE comes out of any industry player's mouth, what do they mean, right? And I think you did a really good job of giving us examples of how to do that clearly and concisely. I particularly liked how you even sort of in one chapter later in the book separate out, this is how you might describe SASE to a group of executives. This is how you might describe SASE to a group of networking or cybersecurity professionals. I wonder, without having to quote yourself directly, could you define SASE and maybe in the subtly different ways that you have for those two groups?
Yeah. So a couple months ago, I was asked the same question at the MEF conference down in Miami, and the thought process was, to just keep this on the high level for the executive thinker, it's a software-defined cybersecurity model built on zero trust framework. And that's really the way we look at SASE, is that model built with zero trust in mind, because really the future of all of our security is going to have to be based on a zero trust framework. So we look at SASE and zero trust framework as two sides of the same coin.
That's good to hear, because I've thought of that way a long time. As a matter of fact, the very first episode of this podcast was about zero trust when it was kind of emerging. In fact, SASE wasn't really the thing folks were talking about at that point. This would have been, sort of quarter two of 2020 or so. SASE was out there, but very, very nascently. So I think everyone listening to the show probably has a pretty clear idea of what the zero trust kind of framework is. But with that in mind, I wonder if you could also just kind of go through and, if you will, give us maybe a short list of the sort of sine qua non, of the elements that would include in a successful SASE framework. So there's zero trust. What else would you want to make sure implementing SASE that someone had under control for their corporate network?
Yeah, a lot of times when we're trying to explain to customers, what we're talking about is SASE is the marriage between SD-WAN and security. But moving forward, we had the SSE come up in the market, and we may want to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But to me, SSE is just SASE minus SD-WAN. Now we could get very technical, and we can go through and list the elements. But when we talk about what SASE is, we always teach with kind of a 5-pillar approach, right? So SD-WAN, zero trust network access, firewall as a service, software, gateway, secure web gateway, and CASB, right? And CASB, generally incorporates DLP, right?
Right. Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's exactly what I was looking for. Is kind of like, core pillars of implementing a SASE framework. Absolutely. And yes, indeed. I think later on I want to touch on more about the SD-WAN. But before we get there, one thing that you cited in the book several times from my recollection is this idea going back to earlier software development in the 80s and whatnot, that the 85% perfection rule versus 100% perfection, and that even in software development, if the companies that have tried to get to 100% before publishing or going to the market have often failed. Take us through that sort of history as you presented it, and how it relates to SASE, if you would.
Sure. I think the first place to start is that I think I was born as an engineering thinker, or as an engineer.
It is a certain kind of brain. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. And so from a engineering perspective, growing up with kind of a strong faith-based background, add in military special operations, getting more exacting, in a little mixture of OCD. I think perfectionist is the plague I try to run from as much as possible, because that perfectionism is the enemy of a lot of different types of success, right? So when we look at the players in the market, like Digital Equipment Corporation built a system that I had a manufacturing customer, that made every product they made from, I want to say 1987 until at least 2007, leveraging a DEC Alpha. That's as close to perfection as you can get. That box did not have to be rebooted every 3 years, right? So in that run, it did not have to be rebooted every single year, every single day, every single month, whatever, right? It would run. So, but Digital Equipment Corporation isn't with us anymore, right? Not in that form, right? They failed financially in the market out of their pursuit of perfection. So when we think of perfection of telecommunications, we're thinking 5 nines, right? 5 nines of availability. And when we think of that in software development, your zeros start multiplying really quickly, right? You start getting a number that's got a long string of zeros behind it on development cost. And the worst part of that is market timing. So when we go for 5 nines or 7 nines of perfection, which I've heard people strive for, their dev cycle, their software development cycle for getting to the market, 5 to 7 years. Well, the market doesn't care at that point, right? The market cares now. You tell me about something I can have, I want it now, and that's what I'm going to pay for. So what, and I hope he doesn't see this as negative, but I'm going to say that what I believe the market learned from Bill Gates is that the market buys at about 85% of perfection. And so when you look at the DOS and Windows, and they first came out, they were closer to 85% of perfection than they were 5 or 7 nines. And the market bought big. And, that's why, he became the richest man in the world at one point. Was really he knew the market timing for the product, and he taught us a number of business lessons. And I take away from that the market needs a first iteration of a product that does something useful and is basically effective when it goes to market. They're willing to accept incremental updates that get us closer to perfection. But what they're not willing to wait for is perfection. And so if you look at the numbers as it ties back into this, really what we're looking at is iterative development. DevOps teaches us, the CI/CD methodology, and I think really CI should really be continual improvement, but it's continual integration. And matter of fact, I made that mistake in the book a number of times where I kept putting continual improvement because I really wanted to do that.
Right. You want to redefine the terms for the industry. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So, but the idea is we should do something that works and has value. Deploy that, get input, start your continual feedback loop, right? And from that feedback, iteratively, do that iteration. The next iteration that comes out is better. Maybe it's 10% better. So now we're at 95% instead of 85%. But maybe it's just 3% better. That's okay. We're making forward progress. And so each version that comes out after that should be at least a percentage point better, or getting closer and closer to that perfection without worrying about achieving perfection.
Right. And I like that. I often use in my own work the phrase "done is better than perfect," right? And there's also, if anybody's familiar out there, there's an author named James Clear who has a book basically that's all about getting 1% better. That's iterative progress is actually more efficacious in many cases than trying to strive for perfection. So I think you draw a clear line with that, and why it is involved in SASE in the book. And one of the ways that I found really compelling that you did that in this book was talk about how because the threat landscape never sleeps, right? The bad actors in the cybersecurity world are around the globe and working 24/7 to make sure that whatever technology you have in place is somewhat inadequate, right? That the software development and update cycle for security has shortened to a punishing kind of 2 to 6 week cycle. What does that do for the corporate cybersecurity posture, and how do you think a good SASE framework and implementation will handle that?
Sure. So I think one of the key ingredients in success on SASE is going back to the DevOps mindset, looking at continual integration, I did it again. Continual integration, continual deployment. And what we're looking at is the idea that integration is key. So SASE cannot work in a silo. So today, if I was to deploy a greenfield effective SASE platform, it may start at the 5 pillars that we're talking about, but it's probably going to
Mm-hmm.
have an average of 17 services.
Wow.
Each one of
Mm-hmm.
those services, yeah, 17 on average, right?
Right.
And we're marketing 1 to 3 on a regular basis, right?
Right.
But if you look at the full SASE stack, what we need is essentially orchestration, and we need integration, right? And at bare minimum, all of those need to be sending, to your SIM, any sort of logging, any sort of information. So your SIM can be focusing on understanding, the correlation of the data, looking for trends and patterns. So I say we go a step further, and each one of those services in the stack need to be integrated via API. And
Mm-hmm.
I always advocate putting in kind of an API backbone that is in place permanently, where you basically are publishing all available APIs and then restrict them only by policy. So you're not having to
Right.
do integration. So when you put in your first service, you publish all APIs to a backbone, and now all APIs are available. So the next time you put in a new service, now only you only have to focus on deploying the APIs for that new service, and then you can always restrict what you don't want by policy. But the idea is you're integrating all these services so they can communicate cross-platform, be able to correlate who's doing what, where, and how. But also your SIM functionality is collecting all of these correlated conversations. It is developing a stronger security posture by having awareness of
Mm-hmm.
everything going on every service in the stack.
And that's taking the human element out of that, with the APIs in place, so that you don't have to say, "Oh, do we need to run a refresh on this?" Or do we, once you have your policy in place, that just keeps happening via AI, essentially, right?
Yes, sir. So we basically build an AI ops model that is constantly finding new things that we weren't aware of, constantly creating tickets for us to go analyze, how we need to integrate that. But the answer is we're always going to integrate it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to control it by policy. We're going to orchestrate it, and then we're going to automate it, right? And the
Right.
AI ops model is really leveraging machine learning tools, any sort of correlation and function, to where we can start getting to the point where we have something akin to an AI bot that's automatically solving, the most common problems. So at least 97% of the common problems should be non-human interacted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because this is all way too complex for humans to manage, right? But even at that, there's a level of complexity in terms of, I think, harmonizing a full stack. Like you said, the average deployment might have 17 services. Each of those services have experts in that product domain, and you, I think, pretty convincingly argue in the book, essentially, that there might be a handful of experts in the industry that truly understand one particular domain of the SASE stack, if you will. Um, uh, and it's pretty hard to imagine that expertise being spread across, say, thousands of enterprise networks that have these large threat landscapes. How do you think that, MSPs? Obviously, you're at AT&T, one of the largest carriers slash MSPs of networks around. So this is very much your perspective. But how do you think enterprises should approach this, having sat on their side of the table from a management standpoint in that sense?
Sure, sure. No, I've been the WAN manager. I've been responsible for security and systems engineering, and so I've got the perspective on both sides of the fence, and I would never ask any of my customers to do something that I wouldn't do myself.
Hmm.
And, while that's, an issue for long-term employability with a services company, the reality is, I really believe that when we get to SASE, SD-WAN, SSE, Zero Trust, we get to a lot of these comprehensive security services that you need a managed service offering.
Hmm.
And there's a couple of brands out there. I don't want to get brand oriented in this call, but There's a couple of brands out there that have done a great job of creating a full stack that's fully integrated that you can go buy today. You can buy it on a credit card. You can buy it on a terms, invoice,
Right.
and they will handle everything. But the problem is, the cost, of entry. It's a massive barrier that when we look at just if the only thing we were trying to solve for is trying to build our own SOC with consistent SIM functionality, right? We're looking at $1 million before we start hiring people.
Right.
And
right.
yeah, so
and then can you even hire the people that would be needed to manage those services is the question.
Right. Yeah. You got to poach them, right? If you want those key people that strong, you're going to have to poach them from somebody else, which means that you're susceptible from being poached from in the future. So the problem is either there's a talent gap, there's a labor gap, and there's a financial cost of entry. And so we look at that in terms of one gentleman I researched in the process of writing the book had developed the term ROSI, return on security investment. And that's not something we think about a lot, but that's something we should be. We should be thinking, instead of with ego saying, oh, my people are the best in the world. Well, I mean, they may be the best people in the world, but you can't perpetually keep them on the razor's edge. It just won't work, right? So we start to approach the problem by continual or perpetual learning, where every shift somebody should be learning, 3 different 30-minute segments, learning about how to do their job better, right? Now we should be investing 30% of our labor budget into continual improvement of our skill set for our human analyst or human operations personnel that are trying to keep us alive. Well, when we start adding up all these costs, we're not going to see the average enterprise achieve a return on security investment. And that's why I say, shop the managed services offers out there, have your folks be the advocates, have your folks trained as well as they can to advocate for your company. And really, when we get to complex security models, use a managed services partner, that is doing a good job for their customer. Build in a performance KPI and a user experience scoring clause into the contract. Build an innovation clause into the contract. They need to be innovating where you have 10% less tickets per year or some sort of a 10% improvement performance metrics year over year and how they're taking care of you. And you should be having the industry world-class user experience from their service. And if they're not doing that, they're not the right company to work with. But the reality is the return on security investment indicates that we need a managed service offering to be able to have all the right resources to get the job done.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly strikes me that it might be pretty easy to see the economies of scale in place here, that with this continual education and upskilling cycle, that doing that with a central group that then manages many networks makes a lot more economic sense than doing that thousands of times at each individual company. Now, of course, there are companies where their particular needs are so bespoke, that perhaps different solutions work for different organizations. But certainly, for a lot of organizations, I can see that being a powerful argument. Certainly. Sure. All right, so I wanted to focus in, as I mentioned, literally the first episode of this show when we were the WAN Manager podcast was about zero trust. But take us through your sort of experience with the zero trust framework and how it has evolved and come to play a central part in what became SASE.
Sure. So my model in my head that I keep on zero trust really starts with a lesson that the whole market learned back with 802.1x or 802.11. 802.1x, max security, right? So when we look at max security, a lot of people got hurt really bad implementing identity services solutions from multiple players that relied on max security because we were going in and we were trying to lock down layer 2, but it worked too well. So what happened was when people implemented it, they bricked their equipment.
Right. That is not the goal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for those that aren't aware of the term of bricking the equipment, what it is when you have to RMA the device because you can't even reload the operating system on it.
Right. It is literally a brick at that point in terms of its utility is the origin of the phrase, right? So yeah.
Yeah. But that's effective security. Nobody can access the network.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. If literally no one can access it, then it's a great example of why some people are afraid of AI. That if you take something very literally, right, and well, here we go. I solved the problem. Of whatever pollution. I killed all the humans. Right.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So, if effective but not desirable.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So how did Zero Trust Network Access come along and kind of bridge that gap, if you will?
Yeah. So this has been a problem since the very beginning. So if you look at the history of network engineering, network engineers devised ways to help people communicate effectively, right? So through machines. If you look at the history of security, which predates any technology, the goal is to keep people out, right? To restrict access, right? So to protect and isolate and really to identify threats and make sure the threats don't get access to whatever the precious resource is, whether it's human or financial or anything else. So when we start looking at zero trust, this has been a model where firewall guys and network guys have been fighting each other, since the industry began. And the firewall guy said, you don't need access to anything. And the network guy says, I have to create access to everything because that's what the demand is. And zero trust, looking at that MACsec model, the .1x model, what it did was it showed the type of access that we need to have, which is no access whatsoever. So in my book, I give an analogy about a person in a desert trying to get access to something on the internet to be able to get help to get out of the desert, right? And in that zero trust environment, he's out there in the desert. There's no communications methods at all, right? Just a person in the desert. So when we start to look at how do we get access, there has to be a policy that allows a series of locks to be unlocked, and each lock represents a different level of access to a resource. So it could be access to the network card on your computer. It could be access to your computer in general. It could be access to the Wi-Fi where you're at, the access to the application, access to the internet. So at every level, there's like a little bit of a lock. And the other analogy I use to explain this is you take your favorite escape artist magician, you put them in a tank of water, with that's closed, lock on top of it, fully submerged, can't get any air out of the tank whatsoever, and they've got a series of chains, and each one of those chains is locked, right? It has a series of locks locking them in those chains. Now, to get out of the tank and get oxygen for that person, the oxygen is the precious resource that magician wants to get access to desperately. So what that person's got to do is they've got to unlock each lock or each restriction method one at a time. And once all of them are unlocked, they will now get access to that precious resource, oxygen.
And to take that analogy maybe a little further to show the difference of not having a zero trust framework, it would be kind of like previously if there was just one lock, right? Basically, it's like once you were in, you had access to everything, and the person's identity now really matters in the zero trust framework. That identity is tied to the keys to each of those individual locks, essentially.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah. And without integration, the locks don't complement each other, and each lock should have its own timeout mechanism that has a period of time and a period of policy orientation where when it no longer matches what the policy says for allowance, it goes back to its default mode, which is locked.
Right. Absolutely. That makes sense. All right. Now let's integrate another core part of SASE, which, as you mentioned previously, SASE without SD-WAN is really SSE. Take us through the kind of difference of how the industry has separated SSE out of SASE now, and ultimately kind of what role SD-WAN plays in SASE. And one of the main questions I want to ask you here, since I'm setting it up this way, is I've heard kind of various people say, some will say very hard line that you can't have SASE without SD-WAN. One could not implement SASE without SD-WAN. You almost take that stance in the book, but maybe there's a little room. What is that room, I wonder? So please.
Sure. No, that's where we all started. We all started. So if you go back to December of 2019, when Andrew Lerner coined the phrase for Gartner, SASE, right? It was a series of observations, and I had a couple of projects that were observed in developing that. And to me, I felt it was just a natural progression that we had to have security with SD-WAN. And what we created was a model where there was a series of different services on the same chassis, all connecting back to orchestration, all commonly integrating for telemetry through orchestration, all feeding to a common SIM. So when we looked at that, it started with the SD-WAN discussion. And when we said SASE, we thought SD-WAN is the foundation of SASE, and that's where we need to go. But really and truly, we understand the zero trust is the foundation of SASE. SD-WAN is the complementary solution where it needs to provide secure forwarding of traffic, right? Based on quality mechanisms, based on scoring. But SASE can exist without SD-WAN, and commonly in the market it's referred to SSE when it doesn't have that. But the reality is, what we found was there's a journey. The journey starts with legacy networking going back 7 years ago. That journey was the latest evolution of centralized versus decentralized, for all of our computing networking systems, that sort of thing, right? So it kind of oscillates back and forth, just like bell bottoms. Every so often, bell bottoms are going to come back to the market, right?
That's
that
right.
sort of thing. And so this iteration was, we need to go cloud first. We need to go cloud native, and we need to get there. The problem is nobody was really ready for that. And there wasn't a great return on investment for everybody dumping everything that they had in capital expenditure and going straight to a pure cloud software as a service model, right? So what we needed was, we needed a bridge. We needed a transition plan to get there. So the first step in transition was, to be able to have some cloud applications, some on premise, and some sort of connectivity like ExpressRoute with Azure to be able to get there, right? But what we kept finding is that we're coming short, and SD-WAN brought us another step closer. SASE brings us another step closer, and what SSE brings us another step closer. And what we're seeing is evolution that gives us a roadmap to get from premise only to a cloud native format. And really, that roadmap means that we have to evolve every 18 months approximately in what we're doing from a technology perspective. So if we deploy a SASE project over 7 years, we've lost the whole point of everything.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that is the whole point, is that gone, very much in the MPLS model, it was buy a network for 3, 5, sometimes more years, put it in place and use it, right? And that model is gone from the world forever, right? So, yeah, absolutely. So let's think about maybe an enterprise who is in that place, because I talk to some who are still, right? I'm relying fully on MPLS. We have centralized breakouts. We have a castle and moat security system. What does a successful long-term SASE deployment look like for them in light of what you just described?
Yeah, well, I think initially the first goal is to understand zero trust framework. It's an education problem. Get to the point where you understand what that is. There's not a zero trust framework product, right? It's not a product. It's a framework. It
Right.
specifically states a framework, so you can learn to look at everything you're doing from a security perspective in a zero trust
Mhm.
mindset, right?
But if I could interject real quick, there is in a sense a suite of products that would fall under that definition, right? So like if I'm
Like,
developing like privileged access management or even just something simple like multi-factor authentication, right? So you can sort of like organize these things by like their suite of constituent products, if you will. Does that make sense?
right, right. But you can't buy zero trust. You have to build
Right,
it.
right, right,
Right?
right.
So you can
Hmm.
buy the parts, but
Hmm.
you've really got to understand the model to be able to deploy it. And that comes back to the managed services argument. Should we consume that as a managed service so
Hmm.
we don't have to build our own, right? Don't have to
Right.
build our own SOC, our own, everything, right? As we go through there. But I think on the journey, understanding zero trust framework starts. Then getting effective SD-WAN. SD-WAN allows us to be able to have a hybrid approach to networking.
Hmm.
Majority of my customers um, try to go to pure internet-based SD-WAN and ended up buying back
Mm,
MPLS into the equation for
absolutely.
10 to 20% of the bandwidth, right? So
Hmm.
they
Hmm.
right-sized it primarily based on RTP traffic. They wanted
Right.
their voice to be protected. They wanted to fail safe in case of an internet storm,
Hmm.
that sort of thing. But it's transitory, and at some point SD-WAN will go away. SASE will remain, I believe, for the next 20 years. It will
Mm-hmm.
change names
Right.
periodically
Right.
because that's what we do in the market. But
Yeah. Well, that keeps it interesting for the marketing teams, right? So, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but the reality is, if you've got a good endpoint management solution and a good zero trust framework deployed, and you've got good security, what you would do is all of your apps would be, essentially a published app, that's available from the internet from any
Hmm.
device. But then you would have policy that dictates what devices and what users and what conditions access is allowed to those applications. But in that point, what I've got a ton of customers that are already got there mentally, and they're eliminating private networks.
Hmm.
They're
Hmm.
eliminating their private networks. So they're pulling private networks out. So 80% of their sites on average are going to be a Starbucks model where you come in, there's guest Wi-Fi, or
Right.
there's a hosted 5G on-premise solution that
Hmm.
they come in, their phone seamlessly transitions that, they get access to the internet. There's a little bit of security around it, but essentially it's a guest access everywhere mentality.
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. And which cues me up pretty well for my last question here, actually, which is as frequent listeners might know, I'm often asking guests kind of a question around this topic, which is in that world that you just described, do you think, and in some ways this is kind of semantics, but do you think there's a world in which there's kind of no WAN in the future, right? That we have these kind of security postures in place. You don't need a private network, and it looks more like what networking might look like for a small business or something that just has SaaS products and other as a service products and an internet connection. Is that on the horizon for the enterprise at some point?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the reality, and we're gonna, you know, I hate to give a percentage on it, but what we have seen significant declines in private networking usage, and we've
Hmm.
seen the epiphany in the CIO that says, "I don't need a private network." And the better job we do as an industry of ensuring security and data privacy with published applications, through the internet, the better, that's going to accelerate. So what we're
Hmm.
going to see is we're going to see maybe right now 1 to 2% a year go away from a private network altogether, and
Hmm.
eventually it's going to accelerate to 20% a year.
Right. Right. Which, certainly from the carrier standpoint, that still means transport networks are in place, managed services are in place. It's not like the business disappears, but as a conceptual thing, you think that it is the case that the private enterprise network will essentially disappear in that sense.
Yeah, the private network connectivity becomes more of the carrier hotel, the Equinexes, the digital realty, the hyperscalers, a lot of for AT&T, a lot of the bandwidth they're going to be selling is in that hyperscaler space or that, that sort of equivalent. And then the access piece really looks more like a consumer model, right? So
right.
That's why we're putting so much money into fiber, to every household, every small business, every strip mall, every place we can put fiber, is because it starts to really look more like a consumer model, no matter who pays for it.
Yeah. I mean, certainly. Yeah, I've often said if you have fiber to the premises, you don't even really need DIA per se. Obviously contention rates and that sort of thing. And I think most enterprises will still want to pick something that has some SLAs, even for internet kind of service. But ultimately, we're still a long way from that world in a global network because the internet doesn't work so well in a lot of locations. But certainly in places where it does, I definitely see that future along with you. Jeremiah, this was a great conversation. I think one of the things I really liked about the book you also did in this conversation, which was distilling all of these sort of difficult technical concepts into analogies, stories, that's very clear. So I'll just give a plug for the book in that sense, that it was very readable. I liked also that you could jump around in the book. You wouldn't have to, I read it, front to back, but you could certainly jump into a section that you particularly wanted to bone up on or whatever, and you redefine things there and that. So, thanks very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to write this book. It was very helpful for me, and I'm sure it will be for many of the listeners. How can they find you, the book, keep up with everything that you're doing?
Sure. So if they go to jeremiahginn.us, that'll pull up my LinkedIn profile, and it'll have access to everything I've got going on, which is a wide variety of things. The book's available in about 10 countries right now. We're getting ready to do the Audible format on it, but it's on Kindle and print today. And if you want to just go to Amazon and search on Jeremiah Ginn, what you're going to find is the book is usually the first link that comes back.
Excellent. Are you gonna read it, or are you gonna hire someone to read it? Always
That's
curious about that.
Hardest question.
Yeah.
No, that's the hardest question. Definitely for the other languages, because we're going to do it multiple languages.
Right.
I'm going to have someone else do it. But that's been the hardest question. So we're still working on the answer to that question.
That does take a lot of time, I guess. But I personally, I'm a big audiobook consumer because I've got kids and a job and stuff, and I mostly can read books while moving about in the world and doing other things. And I do like hearing a book read by the author. It just gives it a little bit extra, sort of fun. So best of luck with that. Thanks so much for joining me. This was great fun.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate you.
All right. Cheers. Thanks for listening. Telegeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at Telegeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.